Hello, welcome back to my channel and to my Fighting Fantasy Gamebook retrospective. And this time round I've reached books 15 and 16, The Rings of Kether and The Seas of Blood. Now look, I know it's a long time since my last video, I'm sorry about that, but I'll be frankly honest with you. The reason it took me a long time to get round to these two game books is because back in the day when I was a teenager, I didn't really greatly care for either of them. In fact, I think I only ever played them once each, then I just threw them on the pile. So let's see after all this time if there's anything I can rediscover in them when I return to them. Book 15 sees us go back to the science fiction books. Oh God. And it's also written by Andrew Chapman, who wrote The Deadly Dull Space Assassin. Oh dear. Okay, but fair play to Andrew Chapman. He's come up with an interesting idea here. And the idea is that you're this kind of space security agent who's been sent to this planet where the authorities think there's some drug running going on, right? And you've got to crack the drug running gang. Now, I don't know if you remember me talking about the first science fiction book in the series, Starship Traveller. And what I said was, it had a great concept, but it was a concept that needed to be developed over a series of game books. You know, imagine this concept. There you are, you're an agent and you've got to interview people, you've got to get involved in gangs and go undercover and you know, develop complex plots and counter plots. You know, it would be brilliant if it was over 4 books like the Sorcery series. But here, it's all just jammed into one little book and it doesn't have enough space to grow, you know. The other problem with this book, right, is it's a detective story, right? So you want to get involved with characters and everything. But it doesn't really have any detection. Andrew Chapman hasn't worked out how to be Steve Jackson. He's no Jacko. He hasn't worked out how to make the gameplay complex and satisfying. So a lot of your detection is based on pure chance, right? So right at the beginning, when you go to the main planet, you go to the police headquarters and you roll a die. And if you roll these numbers, you get a bad cop, this guy on the front. Or if you roll another die, you get a good cop who is sort of a bit scared and wants to give you information. So it's not based on your detection. It's purely based on a dice throw. How is that fair? Later on, the book develops this kind of subplot where this cop who's going to give you information, he and his wife, they're going to get chased down by the criminals who are going to kill them. And you're sort of involved, you're sort of witness to them dying. But it's all by chance. You don't find it by discovering clues and then turning to a particular page number at a particular time. It's all just pure chance. You don't really detect anything. You walk through the adventure and you might find the clues and you might not. So much of the action is, it's like the kind of, just like Space Assassin by Andrew Chapman, it's like Christmas annual games. You know, you're on a space station, you have to choose this thing or that thing, and if you choose that you might die, and if this you might go ahead. There's no real sense of a detective piecing together the clues and getting through the story. And at one point in the game it says, well, you've reached the end of the tether now and there's not much you can do. What do you want to do now? It's like, well, if you'd actually built a game where I could move forward and develop, I wouldn't reach this stage, would I? So it's all very odd. And eventually, to be honest, I ended up not really liking it very much. I think it's got a good idea, but it goes nowhere fast. A quick mention of the artwork. The cover is by Terry Oakes. Now, this cover sums up the problems with this book. It's a very good cover. Terry Oakes would go on to become a popular person in the fantasy fighting game book world. He'd do a lot of covers and a lot of good artwork. And this is a very good piece. I've seen this piece reproduced in many places. People obviously think it's very good. But ultimately, it's a fat bloke behind a desk. And this is supposed to be an exciting detective adventure. That kind of sums it up. The interior illustrations are by Nick Spender, and they have the same problem as all the illustrations we've seen in the science fiction books so far. The sci-fi stuff, the spaceships, the control rooms and everything, is really cold and dull and boring. They're lifeless. The book only comes to life when you get to know the characters in the story, the guys that you meet in some shady bar or something. But even there, you know, you feel that Nick Spender, the artist, has got off the leash a bit to explore things, but there's just not enough character or atmosphere in this book to really enliven my interest. So I'm afraid it's a bit of a thumbs down for me. Now, book 16, which is also by Andrew Chapman, but this time goes into the world of fantasy. I liked this even less when I was a teenager. I actually thought this was the worst book in the series at the time. Now, going back and revisiting it, I think I was a bit harsh on it. It's quite jolly and it pottles along. And again, like Rings of Kether, it's got a brilliant central idea. You're captain of a pirate ship. Brilliant. You've got your own crew, you've got your own pirate ship. You go and raid people. Weirdly, right, the idea of the game is you're in this race with this other pirate to try and get to make as much money as you can, to rob and steal and pillage as much as you can, and whoever gets the most money wins the game, right? It's a bit of a slight conceit to rest the book on, but okay. And what's interesting is you make money not just by stealing from wagon trains and other ships, but by selling slaves. You couldn't do that now, only in the 1980s. Anyway, so it's a jolly little conceit, but it's noticeable how often, right, Andrew Chapman sort of gets you away from the boat and your crew, and you go on some lone adventure on some island, and the actual scenes of you with the pirates are not terribly interesting. There's a quite clever bit where you're caught between two armies that are approaching on either side, and you've got to work out which army you're going to go between. Another good bit, another quite clever bit, was where you go on this island and you meet this king, and he gives you a prize for doing this thing for him, which is a bag full of winds, which will help push your ship through the sea. But then you find out, if you've not done the right thing, you find out right towards the end of the book, there's a twist, that your shipmates didn't believe you. They thought the bag was full of gold, and they've opened it up and all the winds have dispersed, and now you're not going to get to win the race in time. I thought that was quite a clever little touch. There's not enough clever little touches like that. There's too many battles at sea with other boats, which are very tedious. There's not enough colour in this book. It's okay, it pootles along. It's probably not the worst in the series, but I just don't think there's enough substance to it personally. Now, this is backed up by the artwork. Let's talk about the cover first of all. Now, this cover is interesting. It's the only cover in the whole series that's done by Rodney Matthews. I don't know if that name means anything to you. Rodney Matthews, I used to collect fantasy art in the 80s when I was a teenager, and Rodney Matthews was my favourite fantasy artist. I collected lots of his books, and I had his posters on my wall as a student at university, particularly these two posters, this massive train and these motor cars with this city on the pinnacles of rocks behind them. I used to look at those posters for hours. Rodney Matthews is a much more fantastical fairy tale artist than we're used to. Like the Ian McCaigs of the fantasy series are much more grittily realistic. This is a good cover of its kind, but it doesn't suit the grittily realistic world of fighting fantasy. I don't think Rodney Matthews was quite the right artist, and maybe that's why he didn't return for a second book. The interior illustrations are done by my old chum, Bob Harvey. Do you remember from Talisman of Death? I'm not very keen on Bob Harvey. I find his work rather bland. And what I said before about this book being a bit colourless, one of the main reasons I didn't like this book back in the time was there's not enough illustrations. I like the illustrations. They give the book a lot of, atmosphere and colour and intrigue. And in this one, there's hardly any. I mean, I remember being outraged. There's no picture for the first paragraph to start you off. What's that about? And what illustrations you get, I find Bob Harvey's style a bit bland, a bit dull. There's a couple of good illustrations here. This one of a sea creature, an island that turns out to be a sea creature is quite atmospheric. But many of his characters are a bit boring and obvious. And I think that's another great weakness of this book. So I'm sorry, a bit of a negative review of these two entries in the series. I never really liked them. I gave them a good try this time around. I promise I did. I really tried to like them. But I don't think they're ever going to be among my favourites. But don't worry, my friends, because next time around, Jacko returns with Appointment with Fear.